Hey, what's up? Today, let's talk about mixing, specifically 5 big mixing lessons that I learned from doing a whole bunch of mix critiques for people. You can take any one of these 5 lessons and apply it tonight to see big results in your mixes. Also, at the end of this video, I'm going to share with you something new that I haven't shared before, so stick around until the end. So here's the story. I've been running Home Studio Corner since 2009. For a good chunk of that time, I offered to do private mix critiques for people. Typically, if you bought my mixing course, maybe you bought the upsell for getting feedback from me. That's typically how folks get feedback from me. This is in addition to the live stream critiques that I do for my members. This is just one-on-one. You send me a song and I listen to it and I pause along the way while recording an audio file, giving you my feedback and suggestions of what you need to do to get this to the next level. It's a really fun thing. That's not the point. I'm not trying to sell you critiques today. I want to sell you, or just tell you, share with you, give you for free 5 big lessons I've learned, because what ended up happening, I thought I was just offering a service to people. It was a way for me to make some money and me to help a bunch of people. What I didn't realize was how much I would learn myself from doing these. It gave me surprising insights into the trends and the common mistakes that people make. Because you might think 400 different critiques would have 400 different sets of problems, and the answer is no. No, not by a long shot. I found myself giving the same advice over and over and over and over and over again. And these are kind of the 5 biggest pieces of advice that I would find myself giving, and I want to give that to you today. So let's start with, there's 5, let's start with number 1. Number 1 is the biggest mistake you could make and the best piece of advice I can give you. One of the biggest mistakes that I would see in these critiques is people would ignore getting it right at the source. You knew I was going to say this. I will continue to say this until the day I die. The best way to get incredible sounding mixes is to start with incredible sounding tracks. The people that I critiqued whose mixes were kind of meh, a big reason why was that they took this idea, this advice of get it right at the source, as a suggestion rather than a requirement. You just can't take mediocre tracks and then suddenly come out on the other side of a mix with something amazing. That's just not how it works. Instead, your goal should be, when you get done recording a song, whether it's a simple guitar vocal or some big, huge production with 100+ tracks, the goal is to sit down with those tracks in your system before you've sat down to mix them. You've just recorded them. Press play, and it sounds pretty stinking amazing before you mix it. If you make that your goal, make that your intention every time you produce a song, you won't do it perfectly, of course. There will always be issues you need to deal with in the mix. That's why we learn how to mix. However, if you get to a point where you're getting goosebumps from just listening to the raw tracks, your mixes will forever be changed. I cannot overstate this enough. And sadly, if 1,000 people watch this video, 995 of them will maybe nod their heads and agree, but they won't actually do anything about it. And they'll go back to their old ways of slapping up a microphone, recording a bunch of stuff, and then spend the next 3 years trying to get it to sound good. Don't be those people. Be the 5 people who actually take this advice and then experience it, and your life is forever changed. Suddenly you realize, shoot, I'm not bad at mixing. I was bad at recording, but once I got good at recording and producing, the mixes were amazing. That's the dirty little secret behind great mixes. All right, number 2. The second biggest mistake had to do with getting it right at the source, but it deserves its own statement, was boring productions. I would hear a lot of songs that maybe they got to the point of having it sound technically good. The guitars were recorded well, good recording technique, but the song bored me to tears. If you want to hear an in-depth discussion of this with some demonstration and some audio examples, I did a video recently called the Verse 2 Rule, which is one of my favorite things to talk about, where we talk about how do we make a production interesting. Here's what not interesting sounds like. Let's say you've got a production and it's drums, bass, 2 guitars, keyboard, and vocal. And let's say the song starts and everybody's playing. In Nashville, we call that an all-skate intro, all-skate, and everyone's playing, and then everyone plays for the rest of the song. That's boring. If everyone is just playing from downbeat to final downbeat, I didn't say that right. That's a recipe for boring. What makes more sense is if maybe everybody starts and then a bunch of people drop out, and then someone comes back in for the chorus, and then somebody else comes back in for, and then you're modulating the dynamics of how they're playing in addition to bringing in elements and taking elements away. This is called producing. So you have kind of two hats you have to wear when you're recording. First is the engineer hat. You got to learn how to just make it sound good. That's its own thing, but it's kind of boring. It's hard. It's difficult sometimes. You can get there. But the end goal is not to stay at engineer. The end goal is to move past engineer and get to being a producer, which is where you're saying, I want this guitar to play this part. I want these vocals to do this thing during this section of the song. That's where the real magic happens. Go listen to your favorite album. You will likely hear something that has been produced very well, in addition to being recorded well and mixed well and mastered well. The production is like the secret sauce of the whole thing. Okay? All right. Number 3, big lesson I learned from doing over 400 private mix critiques. First of all, we're going to talk about mixing for the next few suggestions. Typically, the solution was a simple thing, not a complicated thing. And the next 3 are going to be examples of that. So number 3 is there were typically one or more basic level problems in the mix, meaning the volumes were just wrong. This is incredibly important, and this is another one where most people are going to nod their heads and say, sure, I got it, and then run off to proceed to not get it. What I'm talking about here is things like, let's say, I heard one just the other day. The overall mix was balanced. Everything was kind of in its right place volume-wise, except the snare drum was like 10 dB louder than everything else in the mix. Guess what happens when you do that? If you do that early in your mix and you start to just normalize that snare is just stupid loud, you're going to start doing all kinds of stuff to that snare to make it work in the mix. You're going to add compression. You're going to do parallel processing. You're going to try to use what are those things, those transient designers. You're going to try to use a limiter. You're going to try to do some sort of side chain. You're going to go to all these complicated solutions that you watched a YouTube video about and you're so excited to finally get to use them. Guess what the proper solution was? Turn the fader down. Turn the volume of the thing down. Problem solved. I can't tell you how many times people would send me something and there'd be an obvious problem in the mix and they're thinking it's an EQ, it's a compression problem, it's some complicated problem, and I'm thinking, it's just too loud, or it's just too quiet. They send in a vocal that I can hardly hear and they're like, man, I'm trying to get the sibilance under control. Just turn the vocal up. That's why you can't hear it. So this is why, I get heated because I'm so passionate about it. It's not that these people are stupid. It's just I want everyone to get over this hump because it's a boring hump to be on. Am I right? So when I teach my 5-step mixing process, by the way, step 2, after we set up the software to prepare ourselves to mix well, the first thing we do with our ears while listening is what I call the static mix. We're setting the levels and panning. We are not touching plugins until we've got the balance of everything right. If you do this right, you will notice, hey, that snare drum is twice as loud, 10 times as loud as everything else in the mix. Mayhaps I should turn it down before moving on to all the other parts of the mixing process. Yes, that is the correct answer. So get it right at the source first, then get the static mix right. Get the rough balance of everything right. Then you can move on to solving problems and using all your fancy plugins that you love so much. But if the balance is wrong, no amount of plugins is going to fix that. You're going to have a wacky out of balance mix, and the plugins will probably just make it worse. By the way, if you don't know my 5-step process, you can have a guide for free that shows you how to do it, 5stepmix.com. All right, lesson number 4, this has to do with mixing as well. If there weren't major balance issues in the mix, there were almost always pretty major frequency balance issues. So maybe all the tracks were at the right level, give or take, but then certain groups of frequencies were being little jerks. So I like to think about frequencies in 5 buckets. There are the lows, the really low stuff like 50 hertz. Low mids, which is like, I'd say 100 to 250 or so. Mid-range, 5 to 800, that's what I think of as mid-range. Upper mids, which is like 1 to 3K-ish, give or take a few. And then highs, which is like 8K and above. Those are the 5 buckets that I'm thinking about when I'm using EQ. So when I listen to your mix, if it's muddy, there's too much happening in the low mids. easy. If it's like boomy and woofy, there's too much down in the low, low, low end. If it's harsh and hurts my ears, there's too much in the high mids, maybe too much in the highs, maybe both. And chances are you are older and you've lost some hearing and you're boosting all the highs because you can't hear them very well. Don't do that. Hurts the rest of our ears and makes your mix sound super harsh. Leave it down. Leave it alone. Typically, you don't need to do a lot of boosting in the highs. If you do mixing the way I teach, you're taking care of any muddiness that's there, and that will have a byproduct of making the whole thing feel a little bit brighter. So you end up not having to do a lot of extra boost. If your mixes have tons of high frequency boosts, I'm gonna guess the mixes are too bright. Just throwing that out there. So frequency balance. Do we have a certain group of frequencies that are way louder than the other groups of frequencies? It's a little more tricky because a group of frequencies isn't typically a single track. It's usually a bunch of things, like the guitars are contributing to the mid-range, but the piano is really contributing there. And then you've got that one harmony vocal that's got a lot of buildup in that mid-range. So you've got to kind of realize, oh, this is happening across a couple of different tracks. I might have to do 2 or 3 different EQ moves to get those mids back down. You could do it on the main mix bus, for example, but chances are it's happening in a couple different places. Might make sense to deal with it in those places. It's almost a form of getting it right at the source, by the way. That philosophy carries over through the entire process. All right, the final thing that I learned from doing all these critiques is that the biggest things people struggle with is vocals. I was surprised by this. I've learned here on the channel, typically a video about vocals does better than just about any other video because vocals are challenging. Vocals are the biggest jerks in your mix. And that's saying a lot because guitars can be jerks, bass can be jerks, kick and snare everybody can be a jerk, but vocals are the biggest jerks because you got to get the vocal in front on top of everything in the mix, but it also still has to be pleasant. It can't be too muddy and like boomy and woofy. Can't have a frequency imbalance, but it also can't be so dynamic volume-wise that we're losing the vocal in certain spots and then it's way too loud in other spots. There's a sibilance issue. We got the vocal nice and clean and bright. I can hear the vocal and then they sing the letter S and my ears start bleeding because it's so sibilant. So we got to deal with that. And then there's harshness. Okay, I've got some clarity in the vocal, but now it just hurts. Or it's got that weird ringing at like 2.6K that just makes my ears bleed yet again. I just cleaned them and now they're bleeding again. Vocals are really challenging. Vocals don't have to be difficult. Like I can mix a vocal. Give me like 60 seconds, I got a good vocal mix. But if you don't know what to listen for and which approach to take, and also how the decision you made here will affect the decision you make here, for example, compression here, EQ here, then de-esser here, they're all kind of interacting with one another. So the order that you use them and then the way you think about using them and the whole like entire process of working on that vocal will have a huge impact on how good or bad it turns out. And this is the fun thing I wanted to tell you about that I mentioned at the beginning of the video. Normally I talk about a free guide that I have here. Today I want you to check out a course that I created called Vocal Mixing Guide. And I sold this on my website years ago, and I decided to make it really, really, really affordable for you if you want to dive in and have a masterclass in just how to mix vocals. The class features my process for thinking through mixing vocals, which there's a lot to think about because you got to do a lot of different things to vocals, more so than any other track in the mix, I would argue. And then I give you examples of me mixing an entire lead vocal track from start to finish, the entire process from no plugins to final. Wow, that's an amazing mix. And I do it with both male and female vocals. You can check it out. The price is ridiculously low. I just want it to be a nice resource for you without you having to think much about the price. Check that out at homestudiocorner.com/vocal. All right, that's it for the video. If you liked this one, you'll like this one on what you need to stop doing when it comes to recording vocals. And I'll see you in the next one.